Welcome to Rain Narrator channel where we take you on a journey of deep relaxation and complete tranquility with the sound of raindrops adding an atmosphere of tranquility and comfort. Relax, enjoy, and prepare to enter the world of dreams. If you are looking for an ideal way to relax or calm your mind before sleep, you are in the right place. Follow us to get the best stories. I remember the first time I saw her. I work at a publishing company, just doing my part, helping bring words into the world. It was just another Wednesday morning. I was organizing the office as usual. Papers, emails, some manuscripts that needed reviewing, and then she walked in. I hadn't seen her around before, but there she was, wearing a soft light sweater, her hair tied up in a casual bun, carrying a bag that looked a bit too big for her slight frame. There was something about her, something that made my heart race without really knowing why. She introduced herself as Lily, just Lily, no last name. I remember thinking how rare that felt. No pretensions, no formalities, just the simplicity of her first name. She seemed different from everyone else, effortlessly so. Her eyes sparkled with a curiosity I could immediately relate to. The first thing she said wasn't about work. She asked if the office had a decent library. I smiled, genuinely surprised, and said, it's not much, but we've got a corner with a few shelves. Mostly old publications and some early drafts of upcoming releases. And then, as if to test me, she asked, "Do you like reading?" That question caught me off guard. People at work didn't often ask me that. They might ask about the workload, the deadlines, or the latest corporate development, but never about books. "Of course I read," I said. "I work here, don't I?" Sweetie grinned, clearly enjoying my response. "No, really," she teased. "What's the last book you just for yourself?" I had to pause for a second. But then I remembered a novel by an author I'd always admired. It was The Great Gatsby. I find something new in it every time I read it. Her eyes lit up when I mentioned that book, and she leaned forward slightly. I love that book. There's something about the way Gatsby holds on to a dream, even when he knows it's fading. It's tragic, but beautiful. I nodded, a bit surprised that she'd captured the exact feeling I had about the novel. I'd always read it from a critical angle, analyzing Fitzgerald's prose and the themes of the American dream, but hearing her speak about it made me feel like I was seeing it through new eyes. There was something in the way she talked that drew me in, like she could open up a new layer of the world I'd never noticed before. Over the next few weeks, we found ourselves meeting at lunch, sitting at a table near the window in the small cafe downstairs. At first, we'd talk about books, what we were reading, what we liked, what we disliked, but it soon evolved. She was a philosopher at heart, even if she didn't see it that way. She had a way of asking questions that forced me to think deeply, to reflect. She'd ask, "What's the point of all this?" after a conversation about work or ambition, and I'd find myself trying to come up with an answer, but there was never a simple one. Sometimes I'd get frustrated because I didn't have the words to explain what she made me feel, but other times I'd leave those conversations with new perspectives, seeing the world around me with a different lens. One afternoon, while we were sipping coffee together in the quiet corner, she brought up something that made my heart skip a beat. "Have you ever wondered," she asked, "if we're all just waiting for the right person to help us see ourselves?" I was taken aback by her words, unsure of how to respond. She didn't say it as a question to be answered right away. It was more like a reflection, an observation, and that's when it hit me. Her presence had changed something inside me. Every time we spoke, it was like she was peeling back layers I hadn't known existed, parts of myself I had never explored. As time passed, I began to look forward to our conversations more than anything. Her thoughts always resonated with mine in ways I couldn't explain. It was like we were two people who had lived in the same world, but hadn't found each other until this moment, when our paths aligned. One evening, we were talking about our favorite authors. I mentioned a writer whose work I'd always loved, but had never found anyone who really understood it. Lily listened carefully, then smiled and said, "I've read that too, but I've always felt like something was missing when I read it." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" "I think maybe it's not the writing itself that's the problem," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Maybe it's that no one ever seems to talk about it the way the author intended, like they miss the essence of what's being said." It was in that moment that I realized she wasn't just talking about books. She was talking about life, about us. It was as if she was pointing out that there was a deeper layer to everything around us, and that we were the missing pieces to make it whole. Our relationship grew slowly but steadily. We'd often lose track of time while talking about books, philosophy, life, and everything in between. It was as if we were both the missing puzzle pieces that had finally come together. But there was something else too, something unspoken yet palpable between us. We weren't just talking about ideas anymore. We were sharing moments, and those moments were becoming more and more significant. Her laughter, her gaze, the way she looked at me when I spoke, it all felt different. It wasn't just intellectual anymore. There was a spark, a connection. One evening, after another long conversation that had carried us from work to the late hours of the night, we sat there just looking at each other. I couldn't help myself. I leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest, and kissed her. It was quiet, tender, and completely natural, like it had always been meant to happen. When we pulled apart, she smiled, her face glowing in the soft light of the office, and said, I think we were always meant to meet. I couldn't argue with that. We complemented each other in ways I had never expected. She made me see the world through a different lens, and in turn, I helped her appreciate the beauty of the everyday things she often overlooked. It was a balance between the two of us that felt so right, so effortless. And from that moment on, I knew our love story was just beginning, one chapter at a time. It all started in an airport terminal, a place full of people but strangely empty at the same time. I was just another face among many, lost in my thoughts, waiting for a flight that seemed to be delayed more than it should be. I had a book in my hands, but I couldn't focus. There was too much noise, the hum of announcements, the rustle of travelers, the clatter of suitcases rolling on the floor. But all of it faded when I saw her. She was sitting a few rows away, her face buried in her phone. I can't tell you why, but something about her caught my attention. Maybe it was the way she absent-mindedly tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, or how she smiled at something on the screen as if it was just for her. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect in an airport, where most people are either tired or annoyed. No, hers was pure, genuine, and warm. I couldn't help myself. I found my gaze drifting toward her, trying to figure out what it was that drew me in. But I didn't want to seem weird or obvious, so I turned back to my book, hoping the moment would pass. But as fate would have it, it didn't. A few minutes later, the flight attendant came over the loudspeaker, calling for passengers to board my flight. I stood up, grabbed my carry-on, and headed toward the gate, only to find that there was some sort of issue with the plane. Another delay. I sighed, frustrated, and leaned against the wall. That's when I noticed her again, standing by the counter now, looking at the display boards. She was standing so close to me, yet it felt like we were worlds apart, separated by the usual barriers of time and space. I didn't know what made me do it, but I walked over to her. "Looks like we're both stuck here," I said with a smile, hoping I didn't sound too awkward. She turned to me, and when she smiled back, I knew there was something there. It was a smile that lit up her face, almost like the entire terminal became a little warmer. "I guess so," she replied. "I don't mind the delay much, though. Gives me time to catch up on things." We started talking. It was a casual conversation at first, about the flight, about the long wait, and eventually, what brought us to this place. She was traveling for work, just like I was, and it turned out we were heading to the same city. The more we talked, the more I found myself intrigued. There was something different about her. She wasn't like the usual strangers I met on my travels. There was an ease to her presence, and I felt as though I could talk to her for hours without getting bored or restless. We didn't just exchange pleasantries. We laughed. We got real. She told me about her favorite books and how she loved spontaneous adventures. I confessed that I was a little afraid of getting too comfortable in my routine, which always made it harder to make big decisions. She listened without judgment, and I found that comforting. Soon enough, we were both sitting at the same coffee shop in the terminal, no longer just strangers passing the time, but two people who had somehow connected in the most random yet meaningful way. The hours passed by without either of us noticing. We shared stories about our lives, what we wanted in the future, and what we didn't. It wasn't long before we both agreed that the delay wasn't all that bad after all. Eventually, the gate attendant made the announcement. Our flight was ready for boarding. We stood up, collected our things, and walked together to the plane, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. The conversation didn't stop, though. We talked about everything, our hopes, our past, and even our silly dreams. By the time we landed, something had shifted. There was a spark between us, undeniable and real. It wasn't just the chemistry of meeting someone new in an exciting setting. It felt like the beginning of something much deeper. After we parted ways at the airport, I couldn't stop thinking about her. We had exchanged numbers, of course. But even as I sat on my hotel bed that night, I kept replaying the moments we'd shared. I knew I wanted to see her again, but I wasn't sure if that was just the thrill of a new encounter talking. I texted her that night. Had a great time chatting today. Hope you're having a good evening. It was simple, but I wanted to make sure she knew that I meant it. She replied almost immediately, same here. I haven't had such an interesting conversation in a long time. Let's stay in touch. From that point on, we did stay in touch. We texted, we called, and slowly we started planning our next meeting. What began as an accidental meeting in an airport blossomed into something more. Something I wasn't expecting, but that I couldn't resist. A few weeks later, she invited me to join her on a trip she was planning. She had to attend a conference in a city I'd never been to, and I was more than happy to tag along. We decided to make a bit of an adventure out of it, exploring the city, seeing the sights, and just enjoying the time together. The trip was nothing short of magical. We laughed, we got lost, and we shared moments that felt as though they were made just for the two of us. It didn't take long for me to realize that I was falling for her, not in the whirlwind, heart-pounding way you see in movies, but in the slow, steady way that feels like finding a home. She had a way of making everything feel right. The more time we spent together, the more I wanted to see where this could go. I guess the turning point came one evening as we sat on a balcony, watching the sunset. It was one of those moments where the world seems to pause, and everything feels perfectly aligned. She looked at me, and I could see it in her eyes. She felt it too. What are we doing here? She asked softly. I smiled and took her hand. I think we're starting something. From that moment on, we began to build a relationship, not just based on shared adventures or spontaneity, but on understanding, trust, and of course love. It wasn't always easy. There were challenges, long-distance stretches, and moments of doubt, but we worked through them together. Every time we got to a crossroads, we made the decision to travel together, in every sense of the word. Whether it was physical journeys or emotional ones, we were always together figuring things out. A year later, I stood in front of her, this incredible woman who had changed my life in the place we first met. I held her hands and told her that I couldn't imagine my future without her. I know we've been on quite a journey already, I said, but I want to spend the rest of my life traveling with you. Will you marry me? She said yes. And from that moment on, it felt like we were only beginning to write our story together. I still remember the day we met. It was just another night, me scrolling through my phone, aimlessly surfing the web, and then there she was. I had no idea who she was, no idea that in a few months she'd be everything to me. It started with a message, just a random comment on a post I had shared. I thought nothing of it at first, just a casual reply like any other. But she replied back, and then again and again. It felt effortless the way we clicked. I never expected a simple message to turn into something so real. At first, I thought she was just someone passing the time, maybe looking for a distraction. But every conversation felt different, you know? It didn't feel like small talk. She asked me things no one ever did before. Deep things. Things that made me stop and think. I could tell she was curious, like she was trying to figure out who I really was beneath all the words. I remember one of the first nights we talked for hours until it was almost morning. I had to be up for work, but we kept on talking. About everything. Music, books, dreams for the future, even our childhoods. We shared stories that we hadn't shared with anyone else, not even our closest friends. It was like she was seeing into my soul, and I was doing the same with hers. I could feel the distance between us fade, like we were right there, sitting side by side. Time passed, and the messages became more frequent. There was something special about her, something I can't really put into words. Every time she sent a message, my heart would race a little. I started to look forward to our chats, to hearing her thoughts on everything, to learning more about who she really was. I could tell she felt the same way. We never ran out of things to talk about. We were strangers at first, but it felt like we had known each other for years. But despite everything we shared, we never saw each other in person. We didn't even exchange pictures at first. The thought of sending one felt like a big step, but at the same time it seemed unnecessary. We were connecting on a deeper level, beyond what we looked like, beyond the surface. Her voice, the way she laughed, the way she wrote, that's what drew me in. It was her words, her thoughts, the way she made me feel understood. There were times when I'd wonder if she was just some illusion, if what we had was real or just the product of the distance between us. But every time we talked, those doubts melted away. I never had to question it when she said something that made me smile or when I could feel her excitement through the screen. She was real. This was real. Then one day, after months of this unspoken connection, we finally decided to meet. The moment we said the words out loud, it felt surreal. It was terrifying and exciting all at once. We agreed to meet at a park near my place, a place I'd walked by 100 times, but now, it felt like the entire world was in that one spot. I didn't know what to expect. What if she didn't look like I imagined? What if we didn't click in real life the way we did online? I remember walking there that day, my hands shaking. I kept telling myself, this is real. This is happening. My heart was pounding as I reached the park. I looked around, searching for her. And then, I saw her. I can't explain it, but when I saw her standing there, everything stopped. It was like time had paused just for us. She looked exactly like I imagined, but better. Her smile, the way she stood there with a little nervous laugh. It felt like we had known each other forever. We didn't need to say anything at first. We just stood there, taking it all in. All the months of messages, the late-night talks, the shared secrets. It had all led to this moment. It was more than I could have ever expected. When we finally spoke, it was like no time had passed. Every word flowed naturally, like we were picking up a conversation we had just paused. I could tell she felt it too, the comfort, the connection that was so deep, even though this was our first time in person. There was no awkwardness, no forced silence. We just were, and that day, as we walked around the park together, I realized something that I hadn't even known I was waiting for. This, her, us. It wasn't just the messages or the late-night conversations. It was everything. It was the way we fit together, the way we understood each other without trying. It was the fact that I had spent so long getting to know her in the purest way. And now here we were, discovering that everything we had shared online had been building up to this moment. When we said goodbye that day, I didn't want to let go. But somehow I knew I didn't have to. This was just the beginning. What we had was real. We had waited for each other in a way that no one else could understand. It felt like fate, like the universe had conspired to bring us together. Now every time I look at her, I still feel that magic, like we've been waiting for each other our whole lives. It's incredible how a simple message can lead to something this beautiful. How a connection made through words can turn into something that changes your life. And here we are together, proving that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you don't see coming. It all started when I first met Lily, and to be honest, I never imagined it would turn into something more than friendship. She was the kind of person you couldn't ignore. Bright, full of life, and effortlessly kind. We met in college, just two strangers thrown together by chance. She was sitting in the library one rainy afternoon when I noticed her. Her head buried in a book, a faint smile tugging at her lips every now and then. It was as though she was living in her own little world, and I couldn't help but watch from a distance. I didn't know it back then, but that would be the moment everything changed. I walked over to her desk, probably too nervous for my own good. "Do you mind if I sit here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, eyes wide but warm, and smiled. "Of course, it's a big table," she replied with a grin that, even in that quiet library, made my heart skip a beat. From that day on, we became fast friends. We studied together, shared late-night talks, and had our fair share of laughs. Lily had this magnetic energy, the kind that made everyone around her feel special. I loved spending time with her, but I never once thought of her as anything more than a friend. I was comfortable in that space, and we were good together. But I could feel it, even if I didn't want to admit it. Slowly, over time, I started noticing things. Her laugh seemed brighter than it had before. The way her hair fell over her shoulder when she was deep in thought, or how her eyes would light up when she was passionate about something. I couldn't deny it. I was falling for her. It wasn't an overnight realization. It crept in quietly without warning. It wasn't until we were walking back from class one day, a light breeze brushing past us, that I realized I couldn't imagine my life without her by my side. We were walking close enough that our shoulders brushed against each other, and the sensation made my heart race. It was subtle, but the more I spent time with her, The clearer it became, I was in love with her. One evening it hit me like a tidal wave. We were sitting on the steps of the old building on campus, talking about life, the future, everything and nothing. She laughed at one of my jokes, the kind of laugh that made my heart swell. And without thinking, I blurted out, "I love you." The words were out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted it. I froze, not knowing what to do, praying I hadn't ruined everything. But Lily didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled softly, her expression a mix of surprise and tenderness. "I think I've loved you for a while now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her in shock and disbelief, but the look in her eyes was undeniable. It was as though she had been waiting for me to say it too. "You do?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky. She nodded. "I thought you knew, but I guess we've been circling around it for a long time." In that moment, everything changed. The shift in the air was palpable, and I felt a sense of relief, like I had been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. We didn't need any more words. We just sat there side by side as the world moved around us. From that point on, our friendship blossomed into something deeper. We went from laughing over shared memories to making new ones, to holding hands during movie nights and stealing kisses in the rain. We were no longer just friends. We were partners, two souls intertwined. But I knew I wanted more than just to be with her. I wanted to build a life together. I wanted to be the one she turned to when the world was too heavy, and the one she celebrated with when life was sweet. The decision to propose came gradually, almost instinctively. I couldn't picture my future without her in it. But the idea of asking her to marry me felt terrifying. What if she wasn't ready? What if I wasn't enough? But one evening, as we were sitting on the same steps where we had first admitted our feelings, I took her hand and asked her to marry me. The silence that followed seemed like an eternity, and for a moment I thought my heart might stop. But then she looked at me, her eyes shining, and whispered yes 1,000 times yes. Our engagement was nothing grand, just a quiet moment shared between the two of us. And when our wedding day finally arrived, it felt surreal. As I stood there waiting for her to walk down the aisle, I thought back to those early days of our friendship, to the library, to the walks across campus, to every conversation that had led to this moment. She was everything I had ever wanted, and I knew she always would be. When she finally appeared, radiant in her wedding dress, my breath caught in my throat. She walked toward me like she was walking into our future, and I couldn't wait to start it with her. And so we married, surrounded by friends and family with a lifetime ahead of us. The girl I once called a friend was now my wife, and nothing in the world felt more right. Every day since, I've loved her with the same quiet certainty that started all those years ago. From friends to lovers, from late-night study sessions to lifelong commitments, we had come so far. But in my heart, I knew this was just the beginning. We had many more chapters to write together. I still remember the day we met, like it was yesterday. It was a hot, lazy afternoon at the lake. The kind of day that makes you want to do nothing but lie down in the shade and listen to the sound of the water. My friends and I had decided to spend the day there, taking a break from our usual routine before the school year started again. I wasn't expecting much. Summer had always been about friends, fun, and the occasional trip to the lake. I had no idea it would change everything. I saw her when I was trying to find a spot to set up my towel near the water. She was sitting by herself near a small dock with a book in her hand. The way her hair caught the sunlight made it seem like she had a little halo around her, like she wasn't even real. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. There was something about her, something that felt different from everyone else I'd met before. I could tell she wasn't like the other people around, who were mostly caught up in loud conversations or playing beach volleyball. She seemed peaceful, introspective. It was then that my best friend, Jake, elbowed me in the ribs and nudged his head in her direction. "Go talk to her, man. You've got this." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't exactly the type to approach strangers, especially not someone like her. But something about the way Jake said it made me feel like I had to do it, like it was fate or something. So I walked over, trying to act casual. I remember being nervous, my hands a little sweaty, my heart racing. When I got closer, I cleared my throat and she looked up from her book. "Hey," I said, trying to sound confident. "Nice day, huh?" She smiled. That smile, it hit me like a lightning bolt. It was like everything else around us blurred out. Her eyes sparkled and I felt instantly lighter. "Yeah, it's perfect. I was just getting lost in this book," she said. showing me the cover. I was relieved she didn't think I was a complete weirdo. We talked for a little while about her book, then about how I had spent most of the summer doing nothing. Somehow the conversation flowed easily, even though we were strangers. The awkwardness melted away, and before I knew it, we were both laughing about something ridiculous. Her name was Emma. From that day, I couldn't stop thinking about her. We spent the rest of that summer seeing each other almost every day. Sometimes we met at the lake. Sometimes we went for long walks around town, or sat in small cafes talking about everything and nothing. She had this way of making even the most ordinary things feel magical. I remember the first time I really realized that I was falling for her. We had gone on a hike to a viewpoint I'd never been to before. It was one of those hidden gems, where you can see the whole valley stretched out below. The green fields, the distant mountains. We sat on the edge of a small cliff eating sandwiches and watching the sunset. I'd never been so aware of the way she looked at the world. She noticed things I would have missed. A bird's nest hidden in a tree, the way the light filtered through the leaves, the tiny flowers growing between the rocks. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, it was how she made everything feel more alive. Like she had this gift of seeing the beauty in the smallest things. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt this quiet certainty in my chest. I had never been so sure of anything in my life. I wanted to be with her always, but I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. I could see it in her eyes, too. There was this unspoken understanding between us, a connection I couldn't explain. We spent the rest of the summer together. Late night talks, lazy days by the lake, adventures, and moments of silence where we didn't need to say anything all to understand each other. We were inseparable, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I'd found someone who truly saw me, someone who made me want to be better. Then, as summer began to wind down, I started to feel that familiar ache, the one you get when you know things are about to change. Emma and I hadn't talked much about what would happen after the summer ended. She had a few weeks left before she had to go back to her family across the country, and I wasn't sure what we were to each other, really. I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to ruin what we had. But one evening, as we sat on the dock by the lake, she turned to me and asked, "What happens when the summer's over?" My heart skipped a beat. I didn't have a clear answer. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I didn't want to think about her leaving, but I knew I had to face the reality of it. "I guess we'll figure it out," I said, not sounding as sure as I wanted to be. She smiled, and for a moment, there was this sadness in her eyes that I couldn't hide from. "Yeah," she said softly. "I hope so." We held each other close that night, both of us knowing that something big was changing, and we had no idea what would come next. The last day before she left, we spent our final hours together by the lake, watching the sun rise one last time. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't the end, even if it felt like it at the time. Sometimes love doesn't have to fit into the boxes we try to put it in. It's just something you know deep down, and I knew I loved her. When she left, I felt like a part of me was missing, but I promised myself that I wouldn't let it be the end of our story. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I was willing to find out. Even though the summer ended, the love we shared didn't. It still burns, quietly, in the back of my mind. It's the kind of love that stays with you, even if time and distance separate you. We had that perfect summer, and I'll carry it with me forever. It was one of those days where the sky above Urbid looked like it was trying to pour out its heart, but held itself back. I was young, fresh out of university, and feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. My family had always been tight-knit, traditional, and I knew the importance they placed on family ties. But never did I expect the day would come when I'd be forced into a marriage. Not out of love, but out of obligation. Her name was Layla, a name that always sounded like it had poetry in it. But at that time, I only knew it because she was the daughter of a family friend, someone who had been an integral part of my life growing up. Layla wasn't like the girls I had met. She was quiet, composed, almost distant in a way that made it difficult to get close to her. She wasn't the one I imagined myself marrying, but life, as it often does, had other plans for us. It was my father's idea. He was set on making things right between our two families. After a misunderstanding that had occurred years ago, one that had driven a wedge between us, he said it was time for the two families to reconcile, to make peace. And the only way he thought this would happen was if Layla and I married. He believed it would be a gesture that would heal old wounds. I wasn't convinced. At first, I fought against it. I had my own dreams, my own desires for my life. But when my father's voice grew sterner, I knew there was no turning back.
Layla didn't seem to have much of a say either.
She was quiet, almost passive, her eyes always looking a little sad. I could tell she wasn't thrilled by the idea either. But what could we do? Our families were too important and their expectations were too heavy. The wedding wasn't anything extravagant. It felt more like a formality than a celebration. The ceremony, though beautiful, felt like I was walking through it in a fog. Not really there, just going through the motions. Layla stood beside me, her hand soft in mine, her gaze elsewhere. We exchanged vows not out of passion, but because we had to. The reception felt like an afterthought. Our families congratulated us, but I could feel the distance between us all. The first few months of marriage were difficult. We lived in the same house, but it felt like we were strangers living under the same roof. Layla would spend most of her time in her room and I would be in mine. Conversations between us were scarce, mostly about practical matters, where we'd go for dinner, whether we had enough milk for the next day. Nothing that would bridge the gap between us. But then something unexpected happened. One evening after a particularly quiet dinner, Layla was sitting by the window, looking out at the moonlight over Irbid. The city, with its quiet hills and ancient history, felt like it was holding its breath that night. "Why did we agree to this?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. I hadn't realized it before, but her words made me realize how much I'd been carrying. "I didn't have a choice," I said. "It was my father's decision. I didn't want this either." She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since our wedding. Her eyes were soft, but there was something else in them. Something like understanding, like she had been waiting for someone to acknowledge her pain. "I ever wanted to be part of this," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "But I couldn't disappoint my family. We're just living through someone else's choices." That was the first real conversation we had. For the first time, I saw Layla not as the distant woman I had married, but as someone who had her own dreams, her own struggles. She wasn't just a bystander in our marriage. She had been caught up in it just as much as I was. From that moment on, things began to change. It wasn't instantaneous, of course. There were still awkward silences, still days where we both felt like we were walking on eggshells around each other. But slowly something began to shift. I started to see her in a different light. I realized that Layla was kind, thoughtful, and surprisingly funny when she let her guard down. We started spending more time together, taking walks in the old parts of Irbid, talking about the things we loved and the things we regretted. I started learning about her dreams, her hopes for the future that had nothing to do with our family's expectations. One evening, a few months into our marriage, we were walking along the quiet streets, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Layla stopped suddenly, looking at the lights in the distance. "Do you think we'll ever be happy?" she asked, almost like she was afraid to hear the answer. I looked at her, feeling something inside me shift. "I think we can be happy, but we have to choose it. We can't keep living in the shadows of what others want for us." And that's when it hit me. I had fallen for her. Not the woman I thought she was when we first got married, but the real Layla, the one with her own fears, dreams, and strength. She had been a stranger to me, but now she was someone I couldn't imagine my life without. After that night, things were different. Our marriage, which had started out as an arrangement, became something far deeper. We began to love each other, not because we were forced to, but because we chose to. I found myself looking forward to the moments we spent together. I wanted to protect her, to make her feel cherished. She smiled more often, and her eyes seemed to shine with a light I hadn't seen before. Our love didn't come quickly, and it wasn't perfect. We had our struggles, our doubts. But over time, we learned to trust each other, to build a partnership based on understanding and respect. What began as a marriage of reconciliation between two families became the foundation of a love story I never expected. In the end, I realized that sometimes love doesn't start the way you think it will. Sometimes it grows slowly, like the wildflowers on the hills of Irbid, soft and quiet, but persistent, until one day you realize it has taken root deep in your heart. All right, let me tell you this story from my point of view. It's not the kind of tale I ever thought I'd be telling, but it's the one I lived. It all started when I met her. Her name was Mia. I don't remember the exact moment I first saw her, but I do remember how it felt. There was this warmth around her that drew me in, a calmness that made the world feel a little less chaotic. She had this smile, the kind that could light up a room. I guess you could say it was a bit magical, like she had this way of making you feel like everything would be okay. And when I looked into her eyes, it was as if I could see a part of me that I hadn't even known existed. We spent months getting to know each other. Every conversation with her felt effortless, like we'd known each other forever. I shared everything, my dreams, my fears, all the things I was too afraid to tell anyone else. And she did the same. There was this deep, unspoken trust that developed between us, like we were two halves of a whole. In a world that often seemed cold and distant, Mia was my warmth. But life, as it tends to do, isn't always kind. And that warmth I felt, that trust, and would soon be shattered. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not a huge confrontation. No, the betrayal came in the form of silence. There were signs, little things that didn't add up. Things I ignored because I wanted to believe in what we had. She started pulling away. She became distant, almost like she was slipping through my fingers. But it wasn't until I saw the messages that it truly hit me. Messages from someone else. Someone she had been seeing behind my back. I won't lie, it broke me. It felt like the ground beneath me had cracked open, and I was falling into this endless void. I remember sitting in my room, staring at my phone, unable to comprehend what I was reading. It wasn't just the fact that she'd betrayed me. It was the lies, the secrecy, the way I had been kept in the dark while she built another reality behind my back. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but all I could do was sit there, paralyzed by the weight of it all. When I confronted her, the words didn't come out the way I wanted. I wanted to be calm, to understand why, but instead I was a mess. I remember her face and the guilt in her eyes, the sadness. She didn't even try to deny it. She told me everything. How it had started slowly, how she felt disconnected, how one thing led to another, and before she knew it, she had crossed a line she could never come back from. I listened, though I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping even then that she would tell me it was all a mistake, that she still loved me. But she didn't. She apologized over and over. But it didn't change the fact that I felt betrayed. We broke up, obviously. She left, and I was left with this hollow feeling inside. The kind of emptiness that comes from realizing the person you trusted most in the world was never who you thought they were. For a long time, I didn't know how to move on. Every song, every memory, every place we went together reminded me of her. I became this version of myself I didn't recognize, angry, bitter, and disconnected. I pushed everyone away, trying to avoid feeling anything. I didn't want to love again. I didn't think I could. Then months later, she reached out. At first, I ignored her messages. Why would I want to talk to her? Why would I open myself up to more pain? But she kept sending them. Short ones at first, asking how I was, hoping I was okay. I wasn't, I was far from it, but I still couldn't bring myself to block her. One day I gave in. We talked. It was awkward at first. There were a lot of silences between us. But she told me something I wasn't expecting. She wasn't asking for my forgiveness, not yet. Anyway, but she wanted to explain herself. And this time she wasn't apologizing to get off the hook. She was telling me about the loneliness she felt, about how she had made a mistake, and how she regretted it every single day. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to yell at her, to tell her she ruined everything. But another part of me still cared. So I listened. I listened to the girl I thought I knew. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't the ideal I had created in my head, but she was human. And that was something I hadn't fully realized before. She had made mistakes, sure, but so had I. Maybe not in the same way, but I had my flaws too. We started talking again slowly. It wasn't like it was before. I didn't trust her right away, not by any means. It took time, and so much time. I had to rebuild that trust piece by piece, day by day. I had to let go of the resentment I'd been carrying. It wasn't easy. It was painful. There were moments when I thought about walking away, when I felt like it would be easier to just cut her off for good. But I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, we had something worth saving. Eventually we met up. We sat in a small cafe, our hands hovering near each other but never quite touching. We really talked for the first time in so long, and as we spoke I realized something. The love we had was still there. It hadn't disappeared completely even though I thought it had. It had been buried beneath all the hurt and betrayal, but it was still there waiting for us to uncover it. I don't know if it was forgiveness or something else entirely, but I realized that holding on to the past, to the anger, would only keep us both stuck in the same place. I had to let go of what happened and trust her again. Not because I owed it to her, but because I owed it to myself to not live in the shadow of something that happened before. So we took it slow. We rebuilt. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, but with each passing day, I began to believe in us again. I learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about the willingness to fight for something even when it's hard. Even when the past tries to pull you back, it's about choosing to trust even when it's terrifying. In the end, it wasn't about the betrayal. It wasn't even about the mistakes we both made. It was about what came after, the choice to rise above it all. We both did that. And we're stronger for it. And that's our story. I was just a young man, no different from anyone else in my town. I worked hard, mostly kept to myself, and found comfort in small routines. But everything changed the day I stumbled upon her name, tucked away in an old letter my aunt had kept for years. It was a name I had never heard before, Amelia. The letter was from a cousin of hers who had moved far away. But what stood out to me wasn't just the words written in it. It was the way Amelia's name seemed to dance off the page. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about her. Even in those few lines that drew me in, I couldn't stop thinking about her. So naturally, I decided to do something crazy. I wrote a letter to her. A simple introduction, really. I told her who I was, how I had found her name, and how intrigued I was by the way the letter spoke of her. I wasn't expecting anything in return. I mean, why would I? We were strangers, and the chances of her even remembering my letter seemed slim. But then a few weeks later, a letter arrived. My hands shook as I opened it. It was from Amelia. She had been surprised, of course. "Who is this mysterious man writing to me out of the blue?" she asked, half amused, half curious. But she was kind and polite, and in her words, I felt a warmth I hadn't known before. She told me a little about herself. The things she loved, like her love for reading and her passion for painting. Two things that instantly connected with me. We began to write back and forth. Her letters were filled with stories, dreams, and insights that made me feel as though I was slowly uncovering a world I had no idea I was missing. We talked about everything, our childhoods, our favorite books, our families. It was strange how easy it was to tell her things I had never shared with anyone. I found myself eagerly awaiting the days when a new letter would arrive. Her handwriting, delicate, careful, became something I longed to see. But as much as I loved her words, something was missing. I wanted to know her more than just through the ink on paper. One evening I took a leap and I suggested we meet. What if we could see each other's faces when we talk? Instead of just reading words, I wrote. I didn't expect her to say yes, of course. Meeting someone you've never seen, never truly known, can be a terrifying prospect. But to my surprise, she agreed. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in the town square. I'll never forget that day. My heart raced as I walked through the door, scanning the crowd, trying to spot her. And then, across the room, there she was, Amelia. She looked just as I had imagined, graceful, with a soft smile and eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. I almost couldn't breathe when I saw her. The moment we locked eyes, all the nervousness I'd felt vanished. We smiled at each other, and it felt like we'd known each other forever. We didn't need to speak at first. It was as if the silence between us was filled with years of correspondence, of shared thoughts and feelings that had already made us inseparable. The conversation flowed easily from there, and before I knew it, hours had passed. Time seemed to slow down when I was with her. From that day on, we saw each other often. We would sit in that same cafe, taking walks in the park, sharing stories, laughter, and dreams. Slowly, what had started as a connection through letters turned into something more real, something more profound. I could feel my heart opening in a way I had never allowed it to before. Amelia was more than I had imagined, and with every moment, I found myself falling for her more. Then came the day when I knew I could no longer hide it. We were sitting by the river watching the sun dip low, the sky painted with colors of pink and gold. I turned to her, my voice shaky, and told her that I loved her. I told her how deeply I had come to care for her, how my heart had been stolen without my realizing it. Amelia's eyes softened and she took my hand in hers. She didn't need to say it aloud for me to know that she felt the same way. Her smile was everything I needed to hear. From that moment, we were no longer just two people writing letters. We were partners side by side, making memories together. We shared our hopes, our fears, and our futures. Every day with her was a new adventure, a new chance to explore this love that had grown from a simple letter into a deep, abiding bond. Months passed, and then one winter evening, I took her to the place where we had first met. The cafe, now glowing with warm light, was quiet and intimate. I had arranged for a small table by the window. As she sat down, I knelt before her, holding the ring I had carefully picked out. "Amelia," I said, my voice filled with emotion, "from the moment I wrote that first letter to you, I knew something had changed in me. And now I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Her eyes glistened as she smiled, and she said yes, her voice trembling with happiness. I slipped the ring on her finger, and in that moment everything felt perfect. The letters, the meetings, the love we had built, it had all led to this. We were married that summer, surrounded by our friends and family. The vows we exchanged were simple, yet filled with meaning. "I promise to love you with all my heart," I said, "and to always cherish the story we've written together." Amelia and I are now living our lives, every day a new page in our shared story. Sometimes I still take out the old letters, the ones where we first began. I read them and I smile, knowing that what started as a simple correspondence became the greatest love story I could have ever imagined. I remember the first time I saw her, how she stood there, like a beam of light cutting through the ordinary. It was one of those moments when time seems to stop. I was standing outside the coffee shop, hands in my pockets, trying to forget the weight of the world when she walked by. She was laughing, her eyes bright, her hair catching the wind in a way that made everything around her seem dull. I remember thinking, who is she? Her name was Sophie. It wasn't long before we bumped into each other, literally. I was clumsy, as I usually am, and knocked her coffee all over her. It was the most embarrassing moment of my life. But instead of being angry, she laughed, her voice ringing out like music. "I guess I needed a new one anyway," she said with a grin. That was the beginning. We started talking, and just like that, a friendship was born. There was an ease between us that I couldn't explain. I was drawn to her in a way I never expected, but I tried to keep my distance, unsure of what I was feeling. She was different. She had this confidence, a quiet strength, but also a vulnerability hidden behind those sparkling eyes. It was a few months before I realized I was in love with her. It wasn't the grand gestures or the big romantic moments. It was the small, everyday things, like the way she would smile when I walked into a room, or how she'd listen to me talk about nothing for hours. The way her hand fit perfectly in mine when we walked side by side. We never had to say much. We just understood each other. And so it happened slowly, naturally. One day I told her how I felt. I remember the nervousness, the fear of rejection, but I couldn't keep it in any longer. "Sophie, I think I'm falling in love with you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes softened, and then she smiled. "I think I've been waiting for you to say that," she whispered back, and in that moment, my heart felt like it would explode. From that point on, it was us, together. Every day was an adventure. We traveled, we laughed. We fought over small things like what movie to watch or which restaurant to go to, but through it all, I knew we were building something special. The love we had was real, honest, and pure. We spent hours dreaming about the future, making plans, imagining our life together. I could picture us growing old together, having children, living in a house surrounded by roses. She was everything I had ever wanted. A year later, I proposed. I was nervous, my palms sweaty as I dropped to one knee. "Sophie, will you marry me?" I asked, holding the ring in front of her. Her face lit up with joy, and she said yes without hesitation. My heart soared. She was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. We began planning the wedding, each step bringing us closer to the day we would officially become one. We were in love, and everything felt perfect. But things started changing around 6 months before the wedding. It was subtle at first, a missed phone call here, a delayed text there. Sophie wasn't as present as she once was. I noticed the shift, but didn't want to admit it. Maybe she's just stressed, I thought. Weddings are a lot to handle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then one evening I came home early from work, eager to surprise her with dinner. I wanted to show her how much I loved her. But as I walked through the door, I heard voices coming from the living room. I froze, my heart racing. I recognized one of the voices. It was Sophie's. The other voice? A man's. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I barge in? Should I confront them? The curiosity ate away at me, but I didn't have the strength to face the truth. Slowly, I walked into the living room, and there they were. Sophie sitting on the couch, and a man I didn't recognize, laughing, their faces close, almost intimate. My breath caught in my throat. "Sophie?" I said, my voice breaking. She turned, her face going pale when she saw me standing there. I can explain," she stammered, but I didn't want to hear it. The room seemed to close in on me, and I felt the walls of my world crumble. How could she? How could she do this to me? I don't remember what happened next, just the numbness that overtook me as I walked out. I left the apartment, went straight to the bar, and drowned my feelings in whiskey, hoping it would numb the pain. The image of them together kept replaying in my mind, her smile, her laughter, the way she'd looked at him. It felt like a betrayal on every level. Over the next few days, I tried to get answers. Sophie was apologetic, explaining that she had been confused, that she hadn't meant for it to happen, but the words didn't matter. They didn't change what I saw. I couldn't look at her the same way again. The trust was shattered, and no amount of apologies could fix it. I ended things with her. I couldn't be with someone who had betrayed me like that. She begged me to forgive her, to give her a second chance, but I couldn't. The pain was too raw, and I couldn't forget the look on her face as she'd sat there with him, her eyes bright with something that wasn't for me. The wedding was called off, and I couldn't bring myself to attend. I couldn't stand the idea of her marrying someone else, but I also couldn't stand the idea of her marrying me after what she had done. I left, and for a long time I didn't know what to do. My friends tried to comfort me, telling me there were other fish in the sea, that I would heal with time. But healing didn't come quickly. It took months, even years. There were days when I missed her, when I wondered if I had made a mistake. But deep down, I knew that I had made the right choice. Sophie's betrayal had taught me a hard lesson. Love wasn't enough. Trust, respect, and loyalty were just as important. And so I moved on, one day at a time, hoping to find a love that was pure, a love that would never break. But I couldn't forget her, not completely. Sophie would always be the one who broke my heart, the one who taught me the painful truth about love, and I'll never forget the way I felt when I realized she wasn't the person I thought she was. The love we shared was real, but it wasn't enough to stop the betrayal that tore it all apart. I'll tell you a story about the girl who changed my life, how she found her way into my heart. Even though we were worlds apart age-wise, I never expected it to happen. I was just a young man so full of life, still figuring out who I was, but then she came along. I first met her at the local coffee shop. I remember that morning clearly. It was drizzling outside, the kind of rain that makes the air smell fresh, like it's giving the world a little rinse. I was sitting by the window, trying to finish an assignment that had been sitting on my desk for days. She walked in with an umbrella soaked to the bone, but she didn't seem bothered by the rain at all. In fact, she looked kind of peaceful, like she was used to walking through storms without getting too shaken up. When she ordered her coffee, I remember her voice. It wasn't loud, not commanding, but soft and steady, like a lullaby. I couldn't stop myself from looking at her. She was older than me, no doubt about it. Maybe by a few years, maybe more. She had this elegance, this grace about her that I couldn't quite pinpoint. It was almost like she had lived 100 different lives, and now, in this moment, she was just content. At first, I didn't say anything. What would I say? What would a young man like me have in common with someone like her? But there was something about the way she smiled at the barista. Something that made me feel like maybe there was more to life than my textbooks and routine. Days went by and I saw her again, always the same calm demeanor, the same grace. Eventually, I worked up the courage to speak to her. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple, "Excuse me, I've seen you here a lot." And for some reason, she didn't brush me off. Instead, she smiled and said, "I come here to think." It's a good place for that. I didn't know it then, but those words would be the start of something that would turn my world upside down. She spoke to me like I was more than just a young man in a hoodie, more than just someone trying to make sense of his life. We talked, and we talked again. Slowly, we started meeting for coffee more often. Every conversation felt like an unfolding story, Like we were both revealing parts of ourselves we hadn't shown none else. What I noticed as time passed was how different she was, different from anyone I'd ever met. She didn't care much for small talk. She wanted to know about my dreams, my thoughts, my fears. She listened to me in a way that made me feel understood, like I wasn't just a boy trying to figure things out. She made me feel like I had something worth saying, worth hearing. And then one evening she invited me to a small dinner at her place. I wasn't sure what to expect. Her apartment was nothing like I thought it would be. It was cozy, filled with books and art, and the smell of homemade food filled the air. We ate, we laughed. We talked about everything and nothing, and at that moment, I couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. I felt drawn to her in a way I couldn't describe. Yes, there was the age difference, but it didn't seem to matter when we were together. It didn't matter that I was in my 20s and she was in her 30s, or that the world would probably judge us for it. What mattered was how we made each other feel, alive, understood, connected. Over time, I realized something else. I was falling in love with her. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. People would talk. They always do. But there was a depth to what we had. Something unspoken, something beyond age or status. She loved me too. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the way she held me when I had doubts, the way she believed in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. I'll admit I struggled with the thought of the age difference at first. I was young. She wasn't. What if I wasn't enough for her? What if the world around us didn't understand? But she'd always reassure me, telling me it wasn't about numbers. It was about us, about what we shared. In time, I understood what she meant. The age gap? It was just a number that didn't define us. What defined us was the way we cared for each other, the way we made each other better, helped each other grow. She taught me things that no classroom or book could. How to love without holding back, how to be patient with life, how to embrace all that comes with being in love with someone. I can still remember one evening when she said to me, "It's not the years that matter, love. It's the moments we create together, and I wouldn't trade any of them for anything." Those words stuck with me. Every day we spent together, we created moments that shaped us, moments that taught us to see the world through each other's eyes. I wasn't just a young man anymore. I was someone who had found a love deeper than anything I'd ever imagined. In the end, love doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about the past or the future. It doesn't care about how many years you have or don't have. What matters is the connection you share, the bond that grows with every passing day, every conversation, every laugh, every kiss. It all started with a simple conversation, nothing more than two people talking, laughing, and being in each other's company. I didn't expect anything beyond that. I was a bit shy, the kind of guy who kept to himself most of the time. And she was different from anyone I had ever met. Her name was Lily. At first we were just friends, nothing more. We met in a group of mutual friends and it felt comfortable, like we had known each other for years. We'd hang out together often, but there was no tension, no hint of anything deeper. It was just friendship, or so I thought. Lily was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. She had this quiet energy, a calmness that made everyone feel at ease, and a smile that could melt even the toughest hearts. At the time, I didn't realize how much I looked forward to seeing her. I thought it was just the comfort of friendship that kept me coming back. But if I'm being honest, it was her presence I craved more than anything else. It didn't take long for us to find a rhythm. We'd talk for hours, sharing stories about our past, our families, the things that made us laugh and the things that made us cry. We'd talk about our dreams and the future, and I found myself confiding in her more than I ever did with anyone. She listened, really listened. It was like I could tell her anything and she'd understand without judgment. It was easy to be around her. I can still remember the moment when I realized something had shifted. We were hanging out one evening, just the two of us. It was one of those lazy, quiet nights where the world felt like it slowed down, and we ended up walking through the park, chatting about the most random things. As we walked, she asked me about something I had never talked about before, something personal, something deep. And in that moment I realized I didn't want to just be her friend anymore. The way she cared about what I said, the way she made me feel seen, it was different. I caught myself wondering if she felt the same way, but I pushed that thought away. I didn't want to ruin what we had, but the more time I spent with her, the more I realized that it wasn't just friendship, it was something else. Every time she laughed, my heart would race. Every time she looked at me with those soft eyes, I felt this pull in my chest. But I didn't want to risk losing her as a friend. I didn't want to make things complicated. So I buried my feelings, thinking that maybe it was just me being dramatic. Friends didn't fall in love with each other, right? But then things started to change. Slowly, little moments began to feel like they meant something more. We'd have inside jokes that no one else understood. I'd catch her looking at me in a way that made my heart skip a beat. There were times when I'd reach out to touch her arm or brush past her, and it felt like electricity, like something undeniable was between us. One evening, we were sitting together watching the sunset. The colors in the sky were beautiful, and there was a peacefulness in the air. It was one of those perfect moments where everything just felt right. We were silent for a while, and then she spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Do you ever think that maybe we're more than just friends? My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe for a second. Had she felt it too? I turned to look at her, and she was looking at me with those soft eyes, waiting for my response. I don't even know how I managed to say it, but I did. I think about it all the time, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, and it was like the whole world shifted. In that moment, I realized she had been feeling the same thing all along. We were no longer just two people talking. We were two people falling for each other without even realizing it. That night, something changed between us. We didn't talk about it immediately, but we both knew. The next time we saw each other, it wasn't just the old friendship anymore. There was something deeper now, something raw and honest. We were nervous, but there was an excitement in the air, too. It was as if we both knew that our lives were about to change forever. From that point on, we started dating. But it wasn't like any relationship I'd ever had. It was slow, gentle, and tender. We were already so close, so comfortable with each other, that it didn't feel like we were starting something new. It felt like we were just acknowledging what had always been there. Every day with her felt like a new discovery. She made me see the world in a different way, a brighter way. I loved the way her hand felt in mine, the way she would rest her head on my shoulder when we watched movies. I loved the way she laughed at my dumb jokes, and how she always knew when I needed a little bit of extra encouragement. She became my best friend and my everything. I think what made our relationship special was how it started. It wasn't rushed. We didn't force anything. We simply let it happen bit by bit until we realized we were in love. It wasn't a sudden thing, and maybe that's what made it so beautiful. We were already comfortable with each other, already connected in ways that ran deeper than just chemistry or attraction. It was a bond built on trust, laughter, and shared moments. In the end, I realized that the best love stories aren't always the ones that start with fireworks and dramatic confessions. Sometimes, the best love stories are the ones that begin with friendship, the ones that take time to grow, that are built on understanding and quiet moments. And that's exactly what we had. A love that blossomed naturally at its own pace, until we couldn't imagine life without it. So now, as I look back on everything, I know this. Love doesn't always need a grand beginning. Sometimes it's in the little things, the conversations, the shared smiles, the moments of silence, that love finds its way in. And for me, it found its way in through Lily.